African nations are losing their forest cover at a higher rate today, despite ongoing conscious efforts to manage its protected areas. While some nations like Rwanda have shown better promise in guarding and reinvigorating its protected areas, others continue to struggle with policy development and implementation. In light of this, IUCN APAC was recently hosted by Rwanda in Kigali, and in this episode of Doing Business in Rwanda, we bring you key conversations from heads of governments and organizations on their agenda for conservation. I'll be your host, Tessie Cavan. More than 2,000 delegates from across the African continent and beyond gathered in Kigali, Rwanda for the first African Congress dedicated to the role of protected areas in the future of the planet. The Congress underscored the importance of African-led conservation. With Africa being quite rich in biodiversity, one would wonder, why has it taken this long for the continent to have this crucial conversation?
This is surprising that it's the first time Africa is meeting to talk about protected area and conservation areas. It tells you two things. One, so if we have never met, how are we doing? What approaches are we using? For who? By who? And what is our role? Or for a very long time. If we are meeting now, so how are we taking care of these assets we have never really talked about? These are the two questions that, and now, if we have never met, who is taking care of these resources? Many of them are transboundary, so you can say a country, but many of them are transboundary. So the response is that Africa has outsourced the responsibility of conservation in Africa to international NGOs, to donors, friends of Africa, who are giving Africa money to finance conservation of the continent. Almost more than 60% of funding for conservation across the board on the continent is foreign funded. And where it's not foreign funded, you see some local NGOs, African NGOs, struggling to raise money, not in Africa, but still abroad, to take care of our assets. And that should not be acceptable to any African citizen, because we know what these assets are. You know, we know how useful they are to us.
Well, the need for preservation and conservation is evident and pressing, but a challenge has been identified. Conservation has often been linked to colonialism, with conservation policies designed by external actors. Conservationists are now calling for the decolonization of conservation.
The legacy of colonialism and conservation is this idea that we need to protect areas away from some people. And that was mostly Africans, pre-independence. So areas are formed and the rangers are trained to keep the communities next to these areas away. The hunting communities became poachers overnight. You had to pay to enter these parks, but you have no job. That's a pre-colonial eras. Nothing, so those approaches have continued. We are protecting these areas for tourism. Tourism is for foreigners, non-Africans mostly. That ideology, the way we've continued doing conservation, has pushed Africans away from the sector, and rightly so, to start looking at conservation as foreign-driven. Conservation agenda having been formed outside of Africa. Some of us who are involved, you know, we are agents of foreign interests. Yeah? That somehow conservation delays development or is against development. All those things are coming from the way conservation is being done and who is doing it and who is involved and who are the beneficiaries have really, for the right reasons, pushed Africans to think and create an opinion on the sector.
Conservation success is too often at the expense of local communities. The colonial conservation policies mostly involved evictions or dispossession of indigenous people. However, as Rwanda's Minister of Environment says, conservation has to be people-centered.
We can't do anything for people without people. We have to co-plan, co-organize, and co-act with people, with youth, with community leaders, with indigenous people to make sure that our development, our protection, and our conservation of biodiversity is people's centered biodiversity conservation. If we do a project, if we implement it, we have to implement for people. So this Congress, the outcome of this Congress is we together, young people, women and men, leaders and led, we have to act together and to live in harmony with nature. When we are talking about biodiversity conservation, when we are talking about environment protection, actually we mean protecting people.
Africa holds a fourth of the global biodiversity, but this is being lost at an alarming rate. And while the climate change crisis has successfully been highlighted, many are yet to fully grasp the gravity of the biodiversity crisis, especially on the African continent.
The challenge of climate is becoming more apparent globally now. We look at a multilateral environmental agreement instrument like the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's been able to bring to the fore the climate crisis. And I think as a global community, we all get it, either private sector, from public sector, civil society, organizations, everybody gets it. But we've not been able to use the right narrative to elevate the biodiversity crisis, so that private sector, for example, can see how it relates to them. We take, for example, the beverage industry. They depend on water. Water is irreplaceable. It's an ecosystem service. And it's not just important for the sector or for the beverage sector, it's also important for people. So how do we improve the quality and quantity of water for people, for businesses, for society as a whole? So I think the key challenge has been about having the right narrative so that everybody understands how they have a role to play.
The huge funding deficit for protected areas is testament enough that the biodiversity crisis is yet to be understood. According to the African Wildlife Foundation, the financial gap facing Africa's protected estate is staggering and urgent. Kadu Sebunya, the CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation, paints the picture of just how dire the situation is.
Protected areas to be managed fairly, not efficiently, but fairly, you require $1,000 per kilometer to be managed, to bring them to a level of efficiency in management. Right now, on average, Africa is investing $50 per square kilometer. There is a deficit in financing protected areas. So the financing gaps not only have to come from Africa, but the entire world needs to chip in, because we are doing it for the entire planet. But Africa needs to lead. Africa needs to take the responsibility. Africa needs to own. Otherwise, if we don't, and we let the rest of the world do the work, then whose assets are?
Africa does need to lead and support its conservation efforts. At this year's Africa Protected Areas Congress, leaders decided to put their money where their mouth is and created a $2 billion Pan-African Conservation Trust Fund.
The Pan-African Conservation Trust Fund is the result of the pandemic, which we have seen. No one has expected that the existing funding system is not sustainable. Even though governments in Africa are putting some funding to conservation and protected areas, when the pandemic came, we noticed that the system has broken, has completely collapsed. So then the African administration of protected and conserved area people, especially the directors of those protected area administration, they came together and said, what can we do in the future, learning from the current pandemic? Because of the climate change and many complications that is going on now globally, you might expect for sure there will be some pandemic coming again and again because of our biodiversity loss. So then if that reality is with us, then we should have also an alternative ways and innovative solutions to do so. Then we thought about to have a Pan-African Conservation Trust Fund. I think that's the basis why we launched yesterday this trust fund, an African solution, African-led and African-based, but because conservation is global and climate change and fighting for mitigation and adaptation to the climate change is a global phenomena, that the global financing is also necessary. But we need to have an African trust fund in this regard.
For many African economies that depend on vibrant wildlife-based ecotourism industry, the Pan-African Conservation Trust Fund is timely and will come in handy. As the IUCN Africa Protected Areas Congress came to a close, different stakeholders made commitments embedded in the Kigali Call to Action statement, with several heads of state, ministers and representatives of government agencies making contribution towards the trust fund. That's all we had for this episode of Doing Business in Rwanda. Thank you so much for watching. We would appreciate your feedback. Connect with us on Twitter. Our handle is @CNBC Africa, or tag me directly at Tessie Carvin. Bye for now.